Ukraine's Kursk operation forced Russia to abandon its offensives in Pokrovsk and Toretsk, as Ukrainian forces carried out a controlled withdrawal to streamline their defensive lines. Russian troops maintained their multi-pronged assault. Russian commanders sought to capitalize on the disruption caused by the suspension of US military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, accelerating their attacks in response. The Ukrainian maneuver into Kursk Oblast was never intended for long-term territorial control. Instead, it was a calculated strategic move aimed at achieving two key objectives. Firstly, it compelled Russia to redeploy vital reserves away from the Eastern Front, slowing their progress in Donbass. Secondly, it provided Ukraine with potential leverage in future negotiations by demonstrating its ability to contest Russian soil. Recent developments in Donetsk Oblast highlight the effectiveness of this strategy. Ukraine's goal was to force Russian commanders to divert resources from their offensives in Pokrovsk and Toretsk. Initially, the Russian High Command sought to avoid this, opting instead to shift troops from other regions, including Kherson and Crimea, and even deploying reinforcements from North Korea. However, as Ukrainian resistance in Kursk persisted, it became clear that additional Russian forces were necessary. A series of failed Russian counteroffensives ultimately forced them to sacrifice their operations in both Pokrovsk and Toretsk. Ukraine's tactical successes have come through a balance of offensive and defensive strategies. This shift in momentum allowed Ukrainian troops to halt Russian advances and regain the initiative. In Pokrovsk, Ukrainian forces transitioned from defense to counteroffensive operations, steadily dismantling the Russian western flank, which had previously threatened to encircle the town. Meanwhile, in Toretsk, Ukraine exploited its increased operational flexibility to launch a series of raids that escalated into a large-scale pincer movement, putting Russian troops in the northwestern sector under significant pressure. Without the Kursk operation tying down Russian manpower and resources, these gains would have been far more difficult, if not impossible, to achieve.
Woo! Dude, that was right behind you.
Give me some cover fire, sir.
The secondary objective of securing Russian territory as a bargaining chip in negotiations has diminished due to shifting geopolitical conditions. While occupying parts of Kursk Oblast initially placed pressure on Russia in diplomatic discussions, evolving US policies and changes in Western support dynamics have altered the broader strategic picture. Although this diplomatic advantage has waned, Ukraine's primary objective, disrupting Russian offensives in eastern Ukraine, has been overwhelmingly successful. On the battlefield, however, sustaining Ukrainian positions in Kursk has grown increasingly difficult. Russian forces have secured tactical and operational advantages, challenging the viability of Ukraine's presence in the region. Russian artillery has established fire control over crucial Ukrainian supply routes, with Malaya Lochna losing its primary supply corridor due to persistent bombardment. As Russian troops advance into Lebedevka from the south, resupply efforts for Ukrainian forces have become increasingly hazardous. The key road from Sumy to Sudzha, already vulnerable to Russian drone surveillance, has become even more exposed, as the Ukrainian-controlled corridor in Kursk has narrowed to just 20 kilometers, complicating troop movements and logistical support. As a result, Ukraine is repositioning its forces for the next phase of the conflict. Recognizing the Ukrainian withdrawal from Harebi, Russian commanders launched a series of rapid assaults aimed at encircling retreating units. One notable attempt was a failed infiltration effort in Sucha, where Russian troops attempted to reach Ukrainian positions by crawling 15 kilometers through a gas pipeline. Russian state media initially claimed success, but later reports revealed that Ukrainian drones had tracked the infiltrators, ambushed them, and neutralized the force almost immediately. Russian sources later confirmed that the few survivors succumbed to toxic fumes. As Ukrainian forces repositioned themselves in stronger defensive positions, rearguard units remained behind to delay Russian advances, enabling the larger maneuver. While most units withdrew in a coordinated fashion, some were inevitably surrounded. Following intense clashes and an unsuccessful rescue operation by Ukraine's intelligence directorate, several rearguard soldiers, having exhausted their ammunition, surrendered only after fulfilling their mission of slowing down the Russian advance. On April 4th, 2025, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that a ceasefire could be within reach if Western nations apply additional pressure on Russia. Ukraine has signaled its readiness for an unconditional truce, but Moscow has yet to formally agree to any terms, with ongoing behind-the-scenes discussions involving the US and Russia. Previous negotiations over a Black Sea ceasefire stalled due to Russia's demand for sanctions relief. Meanwhile, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio reiterated America's commitment to NATO, countering recent criticisms. He proposed increasing NATO defense spending targets from the current 2% of GDP to 5%, a proposal that is expected to be a focal point at the upcoming NATO summit in The Hague. Some European officials are advocating for a more moderate 3.5% target instead. At the same time, the European Union is moving to compensate for the suspension of US military aid to Ukraine by proposing a €126 billion loan initiative to bolster defense capabilities among member states. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas stated that more than half of Ukraine's military support requirements have already been pledged. This effort follows heightened European determination to provide independent military assistance to Ukraine after a contentious meeting between Zelensky and US President Donald Trump, which led to the temporary freeze of American military aid.